Hello everyone, Professor Zeeb here. Welcome back in for another in our series of online lectures. This time we're going to talk about our policy issues in an aging society. Some different policies involving the elderly or late adulthood, which is where we are in the class at this point. So we're going to cover some different topics, different sort of topics to sort of discuss and go over in the class here. So let's kind of go to our slides. We'll open those up. Okay, here we go. So we go to that section in the PowerPoint slides, policy issues in an aging society. In other words, we're going to apply some of the different policies in society to our late adulthood population. So the first thing that we're going to talk about this time are some income concerns and the economy. Okay, so let's kind of look at how that applies to our elderly population. It turns out the concern is high about finances at the end of life. So generally when we interview people about these concepts, we find that they seem to be concerned about money and the economy and their personal finances. In fact, overall, we have found that confidence is very low when it comes to money and thinking about our last chapters of life. You also have to think about that our role in the economy will change as we get older, because the elderly, late adulthood population are often consumers and not producers anymore. So in other words, they probably retired, they're out of the making money sort of scenario, and now they're the ones that are often spending money. So they go from being a producer of income in a household, for example, to being an actual consumer. We have also discovered when we interview people about their finances after retirement that there is a low rate of saving, and that is actually very typical. So a lot of people did not prepare appropriately or simply did not save at all to end life with their finances and so forth. So we find that that's pretty common, that people did not save appropriately or took no action or adequate action in that area. So I thought that was interesting. Next, we're going to look at poverty related to the economy and income and so forth. So we're going to look at some different correlations to living in poverty and then how it applies to our last chapters of life. So now remember guys, as we go through these are correlational data or research results. It does not mean cause and effect, as we've been saying all semester long. You're probably tired of me saying that so much. But anyway, these are some associations we have found of people living in poverty and other issues in life. Number one, people who have lived in poverty for their life often have a slower cognitive speed. So in other words, by the time they get to elderly age and we compare them to people who are not living in poverty, we see a difference in their cognitive skills in terms of how quick and how sharp they are. So I thought that was interesting how it kind of relates to cognitive skills. Number two, more health problems. So people who have lived in poverty or are living in poverty have a greater risk of developing a health problem. That's probably because of lack of access to health care, or they can't afford the best treatments and procedures. There's a lot of moving parts, less nutrition, you could argue, a lot of things to kind of consider there. But when we look at the overall picture, we have found that poverty is linked to more health problems in late adulthood. We've also found, related to that, just kind of piggybacking on that, is that you have an earlier risk of death. So people who live in poverty, we have found often do not live as long as people who don't. And remember, it's probably related to a lot of the issues we've already talked about in the class and what we've just mentioned. The rates of poverty, if we look at the overall picture once again, the rates of poverty seem to be higher in ethnic minority groups and women. So in other words, single women, I guess is what we're saying there. So we have found that certain demographics of people are more susceptible to poverty in the late adulthood population. All right, so next we're going to jump to our next topic, which is healthcare related to these policy issues in late adulthood. We know that elderly health costs are high. So if you guys remember, we talked about that there's a greater incidence of getting a health problem as you age and develop and so forth. And unfortunately, those health problems come with some consequences in terms of cost, because obviously you'd have to pay for treatment, pay for medicine and so forth, and they can sort of add up and build up over time. So the textbook gives this interesting statistic here. elderly healthcare costs represent 1/3 of all healthcare costs in the United States. Wow, so that, remember, that's including every single person in our country. The elderly population, meaning 65 and plus, represent 1/3 of the total healthcare costs in our country. So wow, in other words, a smaller fraction of our society is really kind of producing this burden in terms of the healthcare costs in that community. What's ironic about that is that only 12% of our population is over 65. So 12% of our population represents 1/3 of the overall healthcare costs in the United States. So that's kind of alarming and interesting, but it also makes sense because obviously the older you get, the more likely you are to have a health problem. So it kind of makes sense there. Remember, that number in terms of people over 65 is increasing all the time because the lifespan is increasing. We're getting better at treating medical problems and people are living longer than ever before. So we expect that number to actually go up in terms of the 12%, but also the healthcare costs for that reason. All right, we are going to jump topics. Another kind of policy topic and related topic, you could argue, is technology and the elderly, so this is sort of ironic for me. I'm using technology to talk about technology in a lecture, but here we go. We're going to look at how technology is involved with the elderly population compared to younger generations and so forth. So our textbook gives this study, it cites a study done in 2013, and they have found that 59% of older adults use the internet. It seems like there's this stigma, there's this stereotype that elderly people don't know how to use the internet or they don't use it. But when we actually research it, we find that over half, 59% of people in that population actually use the internet. By the way, that is up 13% since the year 2000. So we know more and more elderly people are using the computer and technology and the internet. It makes sense because obviously the internet came out, what, in the mid-90s or whatever it was. So they've been exposed to that for a long time. And quite frankly, you need the internet to survive today, to communicate with people, to buy things. It seems like we're becoming more and more dependent on technology just to live life. And that would certainly apply to our late adulthood population. So it makes sense that 59% of them are using the internet, despite some of the stigmas and stereotypes that go along with that. All right, let's look at some other findings. So they've made some connections to internet use and technology to different areas that we cover in the class. Number one, people who use the internet in late adulthood have higher performance on cognitive tasks. I thought that was interesting. So the ones that are using the internet and using technology regularly are the ones that are probably the most sharp mentally and cognitively. So there seems to be a connection. Whether that's the computer stimulates your brain or these people are able to use the internet, you could argue there's a lot of moving parts there to kind of consider, but if we look at the research, we see that that is correlated. It's easier to meet people and stay connected with family when you use technology and use the internet. So that may be another reason why we're seeing a lot of late adult 65 plus people using the internet, because it allows them to stay connected with their family. I mean, think about back in history before the internet, where you would have to actually mail a letter and how long that would take, or even a phone call. Obviously that could work as well, but it's simply not the same because now you're able to see the person. You can interact with them in real time while seeing them at the same time. So it really has changed the ball game, and it allows elderly people to stay in contact with grandkids and great-grandkids and all of their extended family members. So it's a great way to meet people, but also to stay connected with family. Another interesting point with that is, think about back before the internet, how hard it would be to date if you were 65 and over. I mean, obviously there were dating services and things like that, but it was much more difficult to meet people who were in the same kind of demographic that you are. So now these dating services online have really opened the door and led to sort of this explosion of opportunity for elderly people to meet people who are in the same situation, the same age frame. Maybe both of them have lost a spouse and they're trying to connect with someone. It's just made it a lot easier to kind of do those types of things. than ever before. So that's really kind of changed things. We've also found that technology reduces the likelihood of being depressed. So I love that one. So we have found that the elderly people, late adulthood members that use the internet and technology seem to be less depressed than those who do not. Probably it's related to the stuff that we've already talked about, because it allows them to stay in contact with family and friends and allows them to feel human and make that personal connection with people. So we have found a connection to being less depressed. So I think we should all encourage our grandparents to use the internet as much as possible, or more importantly, to stay connected with people, to get that bond and that emotional support that obviously as humans we need at any age. All right, so that will conclude our short lecture on policy issues and technology with the elderly. I hope you guys are enjoying the class. Please move on to the next step and we will see you online.